Today is the day. I am now, to the day, the exact same age my father was when he died. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the money to have a midlife crisis or anything. No sports cars for me. But I felt that this would be a good opportunity to talk about death in writing. Death is an integral part of everyone's life, so you'd think it would be easy to implement this in your own storytelling, but everyone approaches death and grief differently, both for themselves and others. My own experience with dealing with my father's death was particularly unique, so I think it might help some would-be author on changing their mind on how they think about death or how someone might react to it. But I'll come back to my story later. Now, I'm sure the vast majority of you are familiar with the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But unfortunately, there are some misconceptions about this which I believe are due to misrepresentations in media. So I'd like to give you my 9 tips on death and grief in writing. Let's look at where the 5 stages of grief come from, and let's start with my first tip. When it comes to fear of death, ignorance is key. Let me introduce you to On Death and Dying by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. It's considered to be one of the most important humanitarian works about care for the dying in the Western world, and it documents some exchanges Dr. Kubler-Ross had with her patients. For that, however, she starts with a brief examination of the fear of death. Death has always been distasteful to mankind, and hopefully always will be, but the unconscious mind cannot differentiate between a wish and reality. If a child wishes for his mother to drop dead because his wants have not been met, and she does, even if a long time has passed between the wish and reality, he will feel guilt and admit responsibility for it. For a child, death is impermanent, much like divorce. This relationship with death can make it abstract and unknown, which leads to fear. Secondly, the mind cannot really comprehend its own demise. It knows it can be killed, but not that it can die of old age. It's a dichotomy between the conscious and unconscious self. But as the conscious mind dwells on its impending doom, while the unconscious remains ignorant, this contradiction can lead to a great variety of emotional responses. Kubler-Ross recounts her own childhood in Switzerland when a farmer fell from a tree, and everyone knew he was going to die. He requested that he die at home, and everyone obliged without question. He spoke to his daughters one by one, and sorted out how his estate would be passed on after his wife died. But things are different now. People are ushered off to hospital, subjected to the medical system while they waste away, and as such, death becomes a more abstract thing, something to fear. So when you're writing a fearful character, it might be good to lean on misconceptions about death, and emphasize their ignorance and unfamiliarity about the subject. Now, although the 5 stages of grief are listed from first to last, it should be understood that these are not necessarily sequential. Nothing in the natural world adheres to such strict mechanisms, least of all emotions. So with that in mind, let's start with the first stage, denial and isolation, and with my second tip. One emotional response can be enough right up until the end. Mrs. K was a 28-year-old white Catholic woman who was a mother of 2 preschool children. She was hospitalized with a terminal liver disease. A careful diet and daily laboratory measurement were mandatory to keep her alive. 2 days before her admission to the hospital, she visited a medical clinic and was told that there was no hope for recovery. The family reported that the patient fell apart until a neighbour reassured her that there was always some hope, encouraging her to attend a tabernacle where many people were healed. The patient then asked her priest for support, but was told not to go to a faith healer. She visited a faith healer and immediately felt wonderful. She was then found in a trance by her mother-in-law while her husband was out at work and her small children were left alone without being fed or otherwise attended to. The husband and mother-in-law brought her to the hospital and left before the physician was able to talk to them. The patient asked for the hospital chaplain to tell him the good news. When he entered the room, she welcomed him in an exalted mood. "Oh, Father, it was wonderful. I have been healed. I am going to show the doctors that God will heal me. I am well now." She expressed sorrow that, Not even my own church understood how God works. She was inappropriately cheerful, laughed, giggled, and reassured her doctors that she was completely well. Her belief in her well-being was unshakable. As the weeks wore on, she talked less and became confused and had delusions of a beautiful bedroom filled with fragrant flowers brought to her by her husband. When she was more lucid, she was helped with arts and crafts to help pass the time. Though she spent much of her time with the double doors of her room closed. The staff rationalized their own avoidance by saying, "She's too confused to know," and "I would not know what to say to her. She has such crazy ideas." As she felt isolation and increasing loneliness, she was often observed to take the telephone off the hook, just to hear a voice. She would sit on her bed holding little bags of sugar between her fingers and say, "This sugar is finally going to kill me." Dr. Ross sat with Mrs. K, and when she held her hand she said, "You have such warm hands. I hope you're going to be with me as I get colder and colder." At that point the doctor knew she had broken her denial and was able to think and talk about her own death, and asked for just a little comfort and companionship and a final stage without too much hunger. She asked for the occupational therapist girl who had helped her make some leather work for her family, so they had something to remember me by, she said. So here we see a woman hold fast to protect herself from her reality, and her husband in turn distance himself to protect his own feelings, which in turn drove her delusions and loneliness. We observed how the family of the dying and their response can greatly impact the experience and behavior of the subject. Second stage, anger, and my third tip. A dying person's anger may not be just about the fact that they're dying. Try to look for other points of conflict. Everyone can relate to the idea of being angry when you're dying because it can feel unjust, but there are many different reasons why one might be angry, even among the dying. Mr. X was paralysed from the neck down and knew he wouldn't have long left. He was allowed a few hours a day without his respirator, and he asked the nurse never to put his side rails up, as they made him feel as though he were in a casket, and she agreed. When Dr. Kubler-Ross entered the room one day, Mr. X was screaming at the nurse for lying to him. She had propped him up like he had requested, but she put the side rails up. She said, "If I had let them down, you would have fallen out of bed and cracked your head open." She was indignant when he asked to be moved, which for him was still a sign of being alive, which he wanted to deny. She spent her time in the corner of the room reading paperbacks, technically doing her duty by being there, but emotionally detached herself to protect herself. The case of Sister I is that of a nun who would roam the hospital, seeing to the needs of critically ill patients, then badgering the staff to take better care of them, undermining their own efforts. After a discussion, it was found that during the diagnosis for her Hodgkin's disease, her opinions had been ignored. The doctors thought that her symptoms were perhaps psychosomatic. It wasn't until her own feelings were understood and acknowledged that she started to calm down. Now, if you're liking the video so far and you want to support me, please consider signing up for my newsletter in the description below. It's got updates about my Kickstarter, other video updates, and games, and all kinds of things that I do. And it will really help me out, so please give it a look, and thank you very much. Now back to the video. Stage 3. Bargaining. And tip 4. A prayer a day keeps the reaper away. I remember being surprised when I first read the third chapter, seeing that it was only a couple pages long when you compare it to, media and whatnot. But its message is pretty succinct. It's, if only there was something I could do. People spend the last months of their lives devoted to God and the church, if only to wish for just a little bit more time. In a story, when a damsel is in distress, all the hero has to do is slay the antagonist and save the day. But when someone is dying of a strange disease, one can find themselves grasping at straws for a definitive solution that most times doesn't exist. Someone might go on a journey to find the elixir of life, only to waste the precious time they had left with their loved one. Of all the stages, this one draws me the most. I think it's the key to a great tragedy. It reminds me of when Orpheus went to Hades to get Eurydice back. And Hades agrees, but he has to leave the underworld without looking back. And when Orpheus, of course, steps out into the light, he forgot that Eurydice also has to step in the light as well. And when he sees her, she vanishes because she was still at the entrance to the underworld. He returns to Hades, of course, desperate for anything that might bring her back, and he's denied. If only, if only, if only. So what kind of bargains, real or imagined, might your character have to keep themselves going? Try and give it some thought. Stage 4. Depression. And on to tip 5. Know when to slow down. Kubler-Ross separates depression into 2 parts. Reactive depression and preparatory depression, as they both need to be cared for differently. Reactive depression focuses on what the patient has lost. This could be anything from their absence leading to the loss of a job, or lack of mobility as the disease takes their vitality from them piece by piece. An example Kubler-Ross gives is when a woman has to have a mastectomy or have a uterus removed. She might feel less of a woman, and so complementing her femininity can help brighten her mood, or implants or prosthetics can give her a much more positive outlook. But preparatory depression despairs over the loss yet to come. It is to facilitate their acceptance of their coming death. It's often an initial reaction to try and cheer up a depressed person, and with reactive depression this can help. Letting a mother know that her children are being looked after in her absence, that they go to parties, play with their friends, and are happy and well, can help tremendously. But with preparatory depression, this can be harmful and distract them from processing the reality of their situation. Preparatory depression is quieter. It can be best to just sit with them and hold their hand, be there for their needs, and sit in silence if that's what they want. To try and force happiness on them is to pander to nothing but your own needs. If you want to do real justice to depression in your writing, try and slow down the pacing of the story, make some of your sentences longer, dwell on certain facts a little bit more, but not too much. You don't want to make it boring, but you need to reflect the emotional tone to make it deeper. Or, conversely, ignore everything I've just said in order to force conflict in your story, if that's how you want to drive your story forwards. But you must remember it as a mechanic in the way your story functions. Stage 5. Acceptance. And my 6th tip, don't forget about the friends and family. Acceptance is not to be confused with a happy time for the patient. They will often seek to sleep more. This is not in the form of giving up or an attempt to avoid the situation. Their pain is abating and the patient's circle of interest is fading. But they need to sleep more in preparation for their final journey. This is often when the family needs more help than the patient themselves. For the patient, there is often a void of feeling in the last days as they fade. Now, this is all, of course, if the patient suffers a slow death. A steady decline of a person can help with the grieving process of the family and friends, and it brings everyone together. But I do remember reading a Reddit post once, and forgive me for this, about a teenage boy who was involved in a motorcycle accident. The doctor who wrote the post was describing the parents in the hospital and how they were joking about how he wasn't going to be allowed to ride a bike again for quite a while. And then the doctor broke the news that he was dead, and the mother screamed a shrill shriek, keeled forwards, vomited, and passed out. Now, that might seem a bit extreme, but that, although rare, does happen. People have very emotional responses. So a bit of over-dramatization isn't that bad, especially when it's abrupt and sudden. So getting it right is important, although you do have to strike the right tone or you'll get something like this. Now, tip 7. Consider the traditions and rituals that surround the death of an individual in your narrative. Just like in the first story in On Death and Dying with Mrs. K, you can just have one of these stages like denial and stick with it until the end, or you can oscillate between various stages. In Leo Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich, the book starts with the perspective of Pyotr Ivanovich at the funeral. It's after the end of the story itself, although at the start of the book, and Peter is worried first and foremost about his appearances and paying respects. Colleagues of the late Ivan Ilyich already had his occupation assigned to the next person, awaiting the moment he died. His English colleague, Schwartz, had a solemnity that belied his playful nature, and he invited Peter to a game of whist that evening. The funeral is clearly a formality to most, but Peter was a close friend and feels impelled to show his due respects to a man he'd known since school. Peter entered the room and hesitated, as people do often in these situations, and didn't know exactly what to do. He figured you couldn't go wrong if you made the sign of the cross. Whether or not you should bow at the same time, he wasn't sure. So he made a compromise and did both. He consoles the widow and they discuss family matters. The whole chapter is delightfully awkward and feels disconnected from the severity and seriousness of death. It's all about abiding by the appropriate customs and doing what's expected. Think about that in your own writing when it's needed. What kind of traditions do the friends and family have to adhere to when in the wake of the character's death? Tip 8. Remember that the stages of grief don't necessarily happen in sequential order, or even at all. Everyone processes death differently. The next chapter jumps back to Ivan Ilyich's life, from his childhood into law school and into a life of a magistrate. He marries partly for love, but the marriage is also one that's approved by society and socially accepted because she's from a well-off background. They have children, some of which die over the years, but a daughter and son remain. Ivan Ilyich's relationship with his wife becomes strained as she wishes for greater comfort, and he takes solace in his work. He gets promoted a couple of times and eventually they're able to afford a luxurious home. Their relationship relaxes, and he takes to decorating when he slips and strikes his side. He thinks little of it, there's merely a bruise, but as the story progresses the pain gets worse. His happy mood deteriorates, and he starts lashing out. This time he's picking fights with his wife, and she learns to strike an attitude to get through it. He consults a variety of doctors, none of which can agree on exactly what's wrong with him, perhaps a floating kidney or something with his blind gut. As the book progresses, his mental health wanes along with the physical, and he's bound to his room. His servant Gerasim treats him with a smile, but doesn't shy away from the truth. And Ivan Ilyich knows he's dying, but he appreciates that. He feels better when his feet are up, so he has Gerasim lift his legs for long periods of time, sometimes well into the night. He sees everyone else, his family, doctors, as liars, unwilling to tell him the truth. But a pang of hope strikes him every now and then, as he slips back and forth from denial to anger. The book takes on a monotonous tone with slow declines towards Ivan Ilyich's death, but for everyone else life continues. He's momentarily surprised when everyone else is all dressed up to go out to the opera, but he bites back his tongue as he remembered that he insisted that they make the reservation to go in the first place. The pain is relentless, and through the facade what he really wants is pity, to be held and coddled in his hour of need, while simultaneously pushing people away. As death becomes more certain, he looks back on his life and the happier times he'd had. But the only true happiness he remembered was an event when he was a child. Everything later than that time felt as though he were heading up a hill, and he realizes he'd always been declining. He wondered if his life should have gone a different way. Regrets piled on, and he lamented his situation even more. In his last 3 days he did nothing but scream. It was unbearable for anyone as close as 2 rooms away. In the last couple of hours he felt as though he was being crammed in a black sack. Then there was a jolt, and his breathing was constricted further. He sees a light, and realizes his life had not been what it should have been. His wasted body shook, then the rattling and wheezing dwindled away, and he was gone. This is a much more visceral take on death than on Death and Dying, which is of course a textbook, so it seems a lot more methodical. Ivan Ilyich oscillates between anger and denial and hope, before reaching depression and perhaps in his final moments a bit of acceptance, but it is gritty and littered with regret. The moral of the story is, of course, that you only live once, and you should live your life to the best way you can, and it's a conventional moral. But the 2023 animated comedy, Carol and the End of the World, takes a different approach. At the start of the show, we learn that a meteor is going to hit Earth in 7 months and 13 days. We passively observe that most jobs have been abandoned, supermarkets are run by the military, presumably to keep the peace, while everyone else in society is living in the moment, making the most of the time they have left. Except Carol. Carol doesn't know what to do with herself. She has no aspirations of surfing or skydiving, but she lies to her parents and the people around her so they don't question her lack of adventure. On a separate note, she is a fantastic example of an autistic protagonist, in my opinion, and how she struggles to convey her feelings and to people who simply cannot understand. Before long, she finds a place with an active cube farm where perhaps hundreds of people are silently working at their desks in a self-imposed Kafkaesque distraction. She quickly finds herself at home there, much more enamoured with the monotony of office labour than ticking off a bucket list. For some people, life is just a space we occupy until we die. And maybe there's nothing wrong with that. But Carol finds herself reticent in front of people she's close to because of the esoteric nature of her desires. The whole show reminded me of one of my favourite lines in a movie ever, in Flight of the Phoenix.
I think a man only needs one thing in life. He just needs someone to love. And if you can't give him that, then give him something to hope for. And if you can't give him that, just give him something to do.
On to tip 9. Consider how a lack of closure might affect the family of the deceased. Right, so, back to my story. My father's name was Christopher William Barker. His parents would have called him William Christopher, except his initials would have been WC. He and my mother split up when I was 5, as was fashionable at the time, and my sister and I saw him every other weekend. He wasn't a great father, wasn't a terrible father, kind of neutral, but I loved him. You know, he was my dad, and I thought fairly well of him. I hate cigarette smoke as an adult, but as a child I used to love the smell of cigarettes, his girlfriend's cigarettes. He didn't smoke himself. And that old pub smell I used to find very comforting, although it's very repulsive now. So one Saturday morning, which was the day I would have gone to go and see him, I was playing with some figurines with some neighbours in the front yard, and a police officer carefully stepped past the figures so as not to break any of them and knocked on the front door. My mother let him in, and I didn't really think anything of it. I was kind of an odd child, I guess, in that sense. One of my playmates thought it was very interesting and wanted to spy in, but I just didn't care, I didn't think anything of it. Then, a little bit later in the day, maybe an hour, maybe less, probably less, I was in the kitchen and my mother was in the living room, and she'd just spoken to my sister, and she called me in, and I came up to the front of the living room, and to my left there was the open front door with the front path, and my sister had started skipping on a skipping rope. And I asked my mother, "What is it?" And my sister piped up somewhat gleefully and said, "Jason, Dad's dead." Although it didn't really strike me at the time, it was very abstract. Again, I'm using that word a bit. It felt fairly neutral because although I understood it cognitively, I think something inside of me didn't really know. Now, if that sounds bad enough, I wasn't allowed to go to the funeral. It was a school day and life continued. Not great. So that led, of course, again, the abstract nature of that led to something of a fear of death. I mean, I was seeing my father every weekend and then suddenly I'm not seeing him anymore, and that's that. I didn't cry about it until a year later, but I don't think that was really because he had died. It wasn't grieving. It was because I missed him. I was still a kid. On that, I was still curious. My autistic mind dug for information. He was reversing out of a field. He was in the passenger seat. His girlfriend was driving. They were hit by a speeding driver who was virtually uninjured, and his girlfriend ended up with some pins in her leg. And supposedly my father died instantly. But this abstract nature of it, I think, led to a fear of death, definitely, for me. And when I was a teenager especially, I remember speaking to a friend of mine in my teens, and we somehow got onto the subject of death, and he said that he wasn't afraid of it at all. And I thought it was just bravado or something, like, of course everyone's afraid of death. It seemed ridiculous to me, of course you would be. But no, I realise now. But then at some point in my 20s, I decided finally to go and see his grave one day. I'm not quite sure how old I was, somewhere in my mid-20s, I think. And I knew which graveyard he was in, or I had a good idea. I guessed it right first time. I walked in. It was a sunny day. Somewhere it would have been the 2nd of July. And I wandered around the graveyard, sort of meandering around until I saw his gravestone, and something inside me in that moment was informed for the first time, and I broke into tears, and I couldn't. It was such a rush of emotion that I'd never felt like that in my entire life. I hadn't seen him in 15 years at that point, maybe, and it was like, I didn't really go through the 5 stages as I've described already. It was kind of like I accepted it twice. Once cognitively when I was younger, and the second time emotionally. It was kind of embarrassing, really, just sitting in the graveyard for a while, because there was like a play place next door, and so you had parents coming and going, giving me weird looks. But I think I needed that moment. And reading on death and dying actually really helped me a lot. Conceptualize, my fear of death and addressing that, and moving on with my life. So yeah, when it comes to your writing, ignorance and a fear of death, and how a lack of closure can lead to a disconnect, and I guess it's all kind of hazy to me. It's difficult. But of course, something striking you in a real way, being told that someone's died, and having this conclusive evidence in front of your eyes, these are two very different things. And that's really what I'm trying to say here. You can have a character in your story who knows that someone they love has died, or maybe they don't believe it. You can go into denial, go on an adventure, and then find something, not even necessarily a gravestone, but some kind of relic or something, and have that moment, that real, visceral moment, where the truth is undeniable. So yeah, now to recap. When it comes to fear of death, ignorance is key. One emotional response can be enough right up until the end. A dying person's anger may not just be about the fact that they're dying. Try to look for other points of conflict. A prayer a day keeps the reaper away. What kind of bargain will help your character cope? Know when to slow down. Drop the pacing when needed. Don't forget about friends and family. How are they affected? Consider the traditions and rituals that surround the death of an individual within your narrative. What are the customs? Remember that the stages of grief don't necessarily happen sequentially, or even at all. Everyone processes grief differently. And lastly, consider how a lack of closure might affect the family of the deceased. So that's it. Those are my 9 tips on death and grief in writing. I hope you found this very useful. And lastly, this is Jim. Jim is a lycanthrope who works as a scribe on a submarine. That's right, he is a lycan subscribe. Jim's parents and all of his grandparents are all alive and doting, and they all love him, and I envy him, that lucky bugger. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.